He wrote a love song for someone he never met, and I realized that someone was me. I did not find the song on purpose. It started playing while I was folding laundry in my tiny apartment, on one of those nights when the fan hums louder than your thoughts, and everything feels unfinished. The title caught my attention first, The Love Song I Never Wrote. I remember smiling at that because my life was full of things I never wrote, never said, never confessed. The song began softly, a tired guitar, not polished, not perfect, just honest. Then his voice came in. It was not the kind you hear on the radio. It cracked in places. It hesitated, like it was afraid of being misunderstood. And then the words started landing, not like lyrics, like memories. He sang about waiting for a message that never comes, about loving someone quietly from a distance without permission, about pretending to be fine while building entire conversations in your head that never happen. My hand stopped moving. A shirt slipped from my fingers and I did not bend to pick it up, because that was me. Every line. He sang about growing up too fast, about learning how to be strong before learning how to be loved, about playing music late at night because silence asks too many questions. My chest tightened. I sat down on the floor without realizing it. I'd never told anyone these things. Not my friends, not my family, not even the people I dated. Yet this stranger sang them like he had lived them beside me. When the song ended, I noticed my face was wet. I laughed quietly, embarrassed by my own reaction. People feel seen by songs all the time. That is normal, but this was different. This was not poetic sadness. This was specific. Too specific. He mentioned the smell of rain on concrete, the habit of rereading old messages, the fear of asking for more and being told no. My phone vibrated. The video had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. This song describes my life. How does he know? I feel exposed. I read them desperately, hoping to feel less alone in this feeling. Then I clicked his profile. A struggling musician, a small room, an old guitar, hope hiding behind tired eyes. I searched his face for recognition, but I had never seen him before. That scared me more than anything, because if he did not know me, then how did he know my life? I opened the message box, typed, deleted, typed again. My heart raced like I was about to step off something high. Finally, I wrote one sentence. Why does your song describe my life exactly? I stared at it for a long time. Then, before fear could stop me, I pressed send. I did not know it yet, but that moment quietly changed everything. Have you ever heard a song that felt like it was written only for you? I did not expect him to reply. That message felt like something you send into the ocean, not something that comes back. I placed my phone face down and told myself to forget about it. I failed almost immediately. Every few minutes, I flipped the phone over. Nothing. I folded the same towel 3 times just to keep my hands busy. My heart felt foolish for hoping. An hour passed, then 2. I was brushing my teeth when my phone buzzed against the sink. I froze, toothpaste on my tongue, staring at the screen like it might disappear. His name popped up. Just a username. No blue check, no polish. His message was short. I don't know. I wrote it about someone I never met. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and read it again. Then again. A strange warmth spread through me, followed by fear. I typed slowly. I feel like you were watching my life. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. That scares me, he wrote. Because I feel the same when people say that. I just wrote what felt true. True. That word stayed with me. We kept talking. Carefully at first, like 2 people stepping onto thin ice, testing every word. He told me he had written the song at 3 in the morning, that it came out in one breath, that he almost deleted it because it felt too personal. I told him I listened to it sitting on my floor, that it made me cry in a way I could not explain, that it felt like someone finally said the things I never could. There was a pause, longer than before. Then he sent a voice note. His voice sounded different without music, quieter, more unsure. I never wrote it for anyone specific, he said, but when I wrote it, I imagined someone listening, someone who would understand. I guess I hoped they existed. My throat tightened, because I had hoped the same thing my whole life. We started sending voice notes back and forth, short ones, then longer, stories about childhood, about nights that felt endless, about learning how to be alone even when surrounded by people. We did not share photos. We did not ask where the other lived. It felt safer not knowing. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt heavy. Hours disappeared. At some point he said, "It feels like we've been talking for years." I laughed softly. I was thinking that. When I finally put my phone down, the sky outside my window was lighter. I had not slept, but I did not feel tired. I felt seen, not in a loud way, in a quiet, steady way that settled in my chest. That night, I realized something that scared me even more than the song. I wanted to hear his voice again. That realization felt dangerous, gentle, and impossible to ignore entirely. Have you ever connected with someone deeply before knowing anything about them? The next morning arrived without permission. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains like it had something to confess, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying his voice in my mind with unsettling precision. It was strange how a sound could linger, not as an echo, but as a presence. I reached for my phone before my thoughts could organize themselves. There was a message waiting. I kept thinking about our conversation, he wrote. I don't usually wake up wanting to talk to someone. My fingers hovered over the screen, suddenly aware of the weight words could carry when they were honest. I feel the same, I replied, and that scares me a little. His response came quickly. Me too, but maybe fear isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's proof that something matters. I read that sentence slowly, tasting every syllable. It sounded like something I would have written in a notebook and never shown anyone. We talked throughout the day in fragments stitched between responsibilities, messages sent during coffee breaks, voice notes recorded in parked silence, thoughts shared without urgency, yet filled with intention. He told me about his childhood home, a place filled with unfinished projects and half-repaired dreams, about learning to play guitar on strings that cut his fingers because replacing them felt like admitting failure, about writing songs not to be heard but to survive the noise in his own head. I told him about my tendency to disappear inside myself, about becoming the dependable one so no one would notice how much I needed reassurance, about loving deeply but quietly, like affection was something that had to be rationed. At some point, he said, It feels like we're filling in each other's sentences. And he was right. There were moments when I read his message and felt a strange recognition, as if my thoughts had taken a shortcut and arrived through his words instead. Still, there were rules we did not discuss, yet both respected. We did not ask for pictures. We did not trade social media links. We did not name this connection. Naming things gives them gravity, and gravity pulls things apart as often as it brings them together. That evening, he sent another voice note. His voice was slower this time, layered with something like hesitation. I've written songs my whole life, when he said, but I think that one scared me because it felt like a letter I never meant to send. Now it feels like someone finally wrote back. I closed my eyes. The room felt smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen. I realized then that this was no longer just coincidence or comfort. This was resonance. Two frequencies aligning without effort, without explanation. And yet beneath the warmth, there was an unspoken tension. A question neither of us dared to ask. What happens when something this meaningful exists only in sound and text? I did not have an answer, but I knew one thing with alarming clarity. I was beginning to imagine him in my life, not as a stranger, but as a presence. And once imagination crosses that threshold, retreat becomes almost impossible. Do you think deep connections need faces and names, or can words alone be enough? The days that followed developed a peculiar rhythm that felt both deliberate and accidental. I woke each morning with a cautious anticipation, checking my phone as though it were a doorway rather than a device. His messages arrived without schedule, yet always at moments when my thoughts were drifting toward him anyway. We began sharing small details that felt strangely monumental. The way he drank his coffee black because sweetness distracted him. The way I slept with one foot outside the blanket because confinement made my dreams restless. These confessions were insignificant in theory, yet they accumulated into something intimate and irreversible. One evening, he asked a question that hovered longer than the typing dots. What does love sound like to you? I stared at the screen, aware that my answer might reveal more than intended. After a long pause, I responded that love sounded like silence that did not demand explanation. He replied that love sounded like a melody you recognized before you learned its name. That answer stayed with me. It followed me through grocery aisles and quiet commutes. It made me wonder how many parts of ourselves are already in conversation long before we consciously arrive. I felt as if the song had been less a creation and more a discovery, something waiting patiently to be uncovered. We avoided the subject of meeting, yet its absence was conspicuous. Every meaningful conversation seemed to circle that possibility without touching it. Distance protected us, but it also sharpened the longing. I began to imagine his expressions, the way his hands might move when he spoke, the quiet concentration I sensed whenever he described writing music. Late one night, he confessed that the song was no longer his. He said it belonged to the people who recognized themselves within it, but mostly to the person who first dared to speak back. I understood what he meant. Something between us had shifted ownership. It was no longer about interpretation, but participation. I realized then that I was afraid, not of him, but of the clarity he brought into my life. He mirrored parts of me I had carefully kept unexamined. In his curiosity, I saw my own longing for honesty. In his uncertainty, I recognized my desire to be chosen without performance. That night, I fell asleep with my phone on my chest, comforted by its weight. I dreamed of unfinished songs turning into conversations, of voices finding each other in crowded rooms. When I woke, the feeling remained. Something was approaching, slowly but deliberately. I did not know whether it would arrive as joy or loss. I only knew that it was inevitable and that I was no longer standing still. I understood that resistance would only deepen the imprint, and so I let anticipation settle, breathing alongside it, accepting that some stories insist on being lived before they are understood. Whatever came next would rewrite me, and I was finally willing to listen without fear or retreat this time. Do you think anticipation can change a person even before anything actually happens? The first time he sent me a new song, he did not announce it. There was no explanation, no warning, just an audio file delivered quietly into our conversation, as if it were something fragile that could shatter under too much attention. I hesitated before pressing play, aware that whatever waited on the other side of that sound might change the careful balance we had built. The melody was slower than the first. It carried patience in its pauses, confidence in its restraint. His voice sounded closer, as though he had leaned toward the microphone, or perhaps toward me. The words were different this time. They spoke of arrival rather than longing, of recognition instead of absence. I felt my chest tighten with an emotion that did not yet have a name. When it ended, I did not know how to respond. Praise felt insufficient. Analysis felt invasive. What I wanted to say was that it felt like being gently understood, but vulnerability rarely travels well through text. After a long moment, I wrote that the song felt warmer, like something that had learned how to stay. He replied that he had written it after our conversations began. That unsettled me more than I expected. The realization that I had entered his creative process, that my presence had shifted his expression, carried a responsibility I'd never asked for. Inspiration is a powerful thing, and I feared becoming a distortion rather than a muse. We spoke about that unease openly. He admitted that creating had always been a solitary act for him, but that lately solitude felt unnecessary. I told him I was afraid of being idealized, of becoming a concept rather than a person. He listened without defensiveness, and that alone deepened my trust. The conversation drifted toward memory. He described a childhood afternoon when music first felt like shelter. I shared a moment when I realized I had been strong for so long that I forgot how to ask for help. Each confession loosened something inside me, like a knot slowly learning it could be untied. That night, I noticed how often I smiled while reading his messages. It was not the careless smile of amusement, but something quieter, steadier, the kind that comes from recognition. I began to understand that connection does not always arrive with urgency. Sometimes it settles gently, becoming part of your breathing without announcement. Yet with every step forward came an equal measure of fear. I wondered how much of him I was imagining, how much of myself I was projecting into his words. We existed in a space where reality and interpretation overlapped, and I was aware of how easily that could collapse under exposure. Before sleeping, he sent one last message. He said that writing music had always helped him understand what he felt, but lately it had also been teaching him what he wanted. I stared at that sentence for a long time, aware that it was both an offering and a question. I placed my phone aside and closed my eyes, feeling the quiet certainty of something unfolding with intention. I did not know where it would lead, but I knew I was no longer untouched by it. Some connections do not announce themselves as love. They arrive first as clarity, and that, I was learning, could be just as transformative. Do you think inspiration can create responsibility between two people? The idea of meeting entered our conversations the way weather changes do, without a clear beginning, only a gradual shift in temperature. No one suggested it directly. It appeared in pauses, in sentences that ended too carefully, in questions about routines and time zones that pretended to be casual. I began noticing how often I imagined him beside me during ordinary moments, while waiting at crosswalks, while choosing fruit at the market, while listening to other songs and wondering how he would interpret them. The absence of his physical presence had started to feel like a shape I could outline with thought alone. One evening, he admitted that he had looked up trains between our cities. He said it as if it were an abstract curiosity, not a confession. My heart reacted before my mind could intervene. The thought of proximity thrilled and frightened me in equal measure. Distance had protected the purity of what we were building, but it had also begun to feel like a limitation rather than a safeguard. I asked him what he was afraid of. He answered honestly, saying he feared disappointing me, feared that the reality of him would feel smaller than the voice I had come to know. I told him I feared the opposite, that the reality might feel too real, demanding a courage I was not certain I possessed yet. We laughed softly at our mirrored anxieties. There was comfort in knowing fear was shared, not hidden. It made the idea of facing it together feel possible, even if the timing remained uncertain. As days passed, our conversations deepened in texture. We spoke about failure with less shame, about desire with less disguise. He told me he wanted a life that felt intentional, not just survivable. I admitted that I had spent years mistaking independence for fulfillment. These were not casual revelations. They were foundations being laid quietly, deliberately. I noticed a shift in myself as well. I listened more carefully to my own thoughts. I questioned habits I had accepted as permanent. The connection was not just drawing me toward him, but toward a clearer version of myself. That realization both empowered and unsettled me. One night, he sent a voice note that lingered longer than usual. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying resolve that caught my attention. He said that if we were going to meet, he wanted it to be because we chose curiosity over fear, not because momentum forced us forward. I appreciated that intention more than he knew. I responded that I needed time, not distance. He understood immediately. There was no pressure, no withdrawal, just patience, offered without condition. That patience became its own form of intimacy. As I lay in bed later, I thought about how rarely I had been given space without being abandoned. The difference was subtle but profound. For the first time, anticipation did not feel like anxiety. It felt like preparation. Whatever awaited us was no longer a question of if but when. And in that waiting, something strong was forming, something resilient enough to survive reality. Do you think patience can be more powerful than certainty in building a connection? The week before we decided to meet unfolded with an intensity that surprised me. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface, yet everything felt heightened, as if my senses had adjusted to a new frequency. Every message from him carried an awareness that soon, words would no longer be the only bridge between us. We spoke more slowly, more deliberately, as though we were memorizing each other before the introduction of reality. He asked about my laugh, not how it sounded, but when it escaped without permission. I told him it happened when I felt unexpectedly understood. He said he hoped to earn that moment in person. One afternoon, he sent me a photograph of his guitar resting against a chair, light spilling across the worn wood. It was the first image either of us had shared. It felt intimate in a way faces might not have. A glimpse of something he touched daily, something that carried his fingerprints and quiet hours. I sent him a picture of my window at dusk, the sky caught between blue and surrender. That exchange shifted something. The world outside our words began to seep in. We were no longer just voices and thoughts. We were environments, textures, light. The realization made the upcoming meeting feel less like a leap and more like a continuation. The decision itself arrived gently. He suggested a small cafe near the station, neutral and unassuming. I agreed before my fear could organize a protest. Once it was settled, a date and time existing in the future, my body reacted with disbelief. Anticipation lodged itself beneath my skin. I wondered what would happen when silence no longer came with typing dots, when eye contact replaced interpretation, when presence eliminated the ability to revise. There was vulnerability in that permanence. Once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. My thoughts moved in circles, rehearsing possibilities I could not control. What if the chemistry dissolved under fluorescent light? What if our ease depended entirely on distance? What if reality demanded more than either of us could give? He messaged me close to midnight. He said he was nervous too, and that comforted me more than reassurance ever could. Nervousness meant care. It meant the stakes were real. I replied that regardless of what happened, I was grateful. For the honesty, for the unexpected clarity, for the song that opened a door I did not know I was waiting behind. He responded with a simple acknowledgement, one that felt grounded rather than poetic. It made me trust him more. As dawn approached, calm replaced fear. I realized that meeting him was not about preserving what we had, but about honoring it. Avoidance would not protect the connection. Only courage could give it a chance to evolve. I dressed carefully, choosing comfort over performance. I wanted to arrive as myself, not a version curated to impress. As I stepped outside, the air felt charged with possibility. For the first time since hearing that song, I felt ready to listen, not just with my heart, but with my eyes. Do you think meeting someone can deepen a connection, or does it risk changing everything? The cafe was smaller than I imagined, tucked between a bookstore and a closed flower shop, as if it existed only for people who were willing to look twice. I arrived early, choosing a table near the window so I could watch the street without feeling watched myself, my hands wrapped around a warm cup I did not remember ordering. Every time the door opened, my breath paused. I studied strangers without meaning to, wondering how many of them carried invisible connections like mine, how many lives were quietly intersecting without announcement. When he walked in, I recognized him instantly, not from his face, but from his presence. There was a familiarity in the way he paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room with a cautious curiosity I knew well. Our eyes met and the world narrowed without effort. The moment stretched, not awkwardly but reverently. Then he smiled. It was softer than I expected, unguarded, as though relief had reached him before confidence could catch up. I stood without thinking. We hesitated, then settled for a brief embrace that felt surprisingly natural, like something practiced in another lifetime. Sitting across from him felt unreal. His voice sounded different without speakers or headphones, yet unmistakably his. There was a physicality to it now, vibrations instead of echoes. I noticed small details I'd never imagined, the way his fingers traced the edge of the table, the slight tilt of his head when he listened. Conversation came easily but differently. There were pauses we did not rush to fill. Silence no longer needed translation. We spoke about trivial things at first. The coffee, the neighborhood, the weather, letting our nervous systems adjust to proximity. Gradually, depth returned, unforced and familiar. At one point, he laughed, and I realized I had been waiting for that sound without knowing it. It carried warmth and surprise, like a room brightening unexpectedly. I smiled before I could stop myself. He asked if the song still felt like mine. I considered the question carefully. I told him it felt less like ownership now and more like origin, a place we both recognized even if we arrived from different directions. He nodded, understanding without further explanation. Time moved strangely again. Hours condensed into moments. When we finally stood to leave, I felt a quiet reluctance, not because I wanted more immediately, but because I knew this was a beginning rather than a conclusion. Outside, the air was cool and grounding. We walked together without a destination, letting instinct guide us. There was no pressure to define what we were. Presence was enough. Before parting, he looked at me with an honesty that felt earned. He said meeting me had not diminished anything. It had clarified it. I felt the same. As I watched him walk away, I understood something fundamental. The song had not predicted my life. It had invited it forward. And now, reality was answering in its own language. Do you think some connections feel familiar because they were meant to be discovered, not created? After that day, nothing returned to what it had been, yet nothing felt broken either. The connection did not explode into romance or collapse into awkward distance. It settled, like something that had found its proper place after drifting for a long time. We did not message constantly anymore. Instead, our conversations grew more intentional. We spoke when there was something to say, not because silence frightened us. I realized how rare that was. Most connections survive on noise. Ours seemed to breathe in quiet. A week later, he invited me to hear him play live. Not a concert, not a stage, just a small open mic night at a dimly lit bar where ambition and vulnerability shared the same microphone. I hesitated, then agreed, aware that seeing him perform would reveal another layer of truth. When he played, the room changed. It was not applause that followed him, but stillness. People leaned in without realizing it. His music did not ask to be admired. It asked to be felt. I watched from the back, unseen, feeling pride rise in me like something personal. Then he played the song, the one that started everything. Hearing it live was different. The lyrics carried weight now, informed by reality. They no longer felt like longing cast into the dark, but like acknowledgement. I understood then that the song had not been about me specifically. It had been about readiness. Afterward, we sat outside, sharing the quiet that follows courage. He asked if the song still belonged to me. I told him it belonged to us both now, not as a promise, but as a memory in motion. We talked about the future, carefully, without expectation, about where we wanted to grow, not where we wanted to end up. There was freedom in that approach. Love did not need to be declared to be present. It could exist as intention, as mutual curiosity. I noticed how differently I held myself around him, less guarded, more aware. He did not complete me, he clarified me. There was power in that distinction. When we parted that night, there was no dramatic goodbye, just a shared understanding that something real was unfolding. One honest step at a time. I walked home with a lightness that did not demand certainty. Later, alone in my apartment, I played the song again. This time, I did not cry. I smiled. The music no longer mirrored my loneliness. It reflected my growth. I realized then that the love song he never wrote had become a story we were still composing. Not through grand gestures or promises, but through presence, patience, and the courage to meet each other where we truly were. Some stories do not end with resolution. They continue quietly, deepening with each choice to remain open. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. Do you think love needs a clear definition, or can it exist beautifully without one? The song still plays sometimes, usually late at night when the world softens and memories feel closer than plans. It no longer surprises me when it finds its way back into my life. It feels like an old friend now, one that remembers who I was, without insisting I remain there. Our connection did not transform into something dramatic or immediate. It grew slowly, with intention, shaped by choice rather than momentum. We learned how to be present without possession, how to care without demanding certainty. In a world that rushes toward labels, we allowed meaning to arrive on its own time. There were ordinary days filled with conversation and laughter, and quiet days where distance returned without fear. We did not cling to constant closeness. We trusted the space between us to hold what mattered. That trust became the foundation of everything else. One evening, months later, he told me he was writing again, but differently. The songs were no longer about absence or yearning. They carried gratitude, reflection, and calm. He said knowing me had changed the way he listened to himself. I felt that same change within me. I had stopped searching for recognition outside my own truth. I realized then that love does not always arrive as fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, as a gentle recalibration, as the quiet confidence that you are allowed to take up space without explanation. Looking back, I understand that the song did not describe my life because it predicted it. It described my life because it listened. It gave language to what I had not yet allowed myself to name. When I reached out to him, I was not responding to music. I was responding to recognition. We still do not know where our story will lead, and that uncertainty no longer frightens me. What matters is that we chose to step forward when the moment asked us to. We chose honesty over comfort, presence over fear. Sometimes I think about that first message I sent, the single sentence that felt reckless and necessary all at once. If I had hesitated longer, if I had decided it was foolish, this entire chapter might have remained unwritten. The love song he never wrote became a conversation. The conversation became a connection. And the connection became a reminder that the most meaningful stories are rarely planned. They are recognized. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. When something feels true, even if it arrives unexpectedly, it deserves your attention. Not every song changes your life, but some invite you to finally hear yourself. And sometimes, listening is the bravest thing you can do. Have you ever taken a small emotional risk that changed the direction of your life?